Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Johnny Coker. In this episode, we're going to learn about the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium, an organization fighting for compensation from the federal government for health problems that they say came from the nuclear fallout caused by the Trinity test in 1945. The Downwinders hold a biannual protest outside of the Trinity Site every spring and autumn when the site is open to the public. They shared their stories with me in this report. East of San Antonio, New Mexico, the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium gathered to protest at the open house of the Trinity Nuclear Test site, where thousands of visitors from around the world come to see where the first nuclear bomb was detonated. Tina Cordova is the founder of the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium. She said that at this point, it's imperative to educate the public about how generations of New Mexican families have been affected by the nuclear fallout from the Trinity bomb.
We decided that if droves of people are going to go out there and they're going to hear the government say that the area was remote and uninhabited, that no one lived here and no one was harmed, and if they're going to over-glorify the science, we're going to be here to tell our history, the history that's never been told or acknowledged.
Cordova said that the consortium is filled with members who are suffering from health problems caused by nuclear radiation, and that attending funerals of friends and family who die early from cancers and autoimmune disorders caused by radiation is common for her.
When they detonated the bomb at Trinity, they harmed thousands of people. At 150 miles, we had 500,000 people living here. It encompassed Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north, and El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south. 500,000 people were living here. That has huge consequence. You can't explode a bomb adjacent to where people live and not expect them to have health consequences.
Bernice Gutierrez is a member of the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium. Gutierrez was born in Carrizozo just days after the Trinity test. She says that she knows over 40 of her family members who suffer from illness caused by radiation exposure, and that she's worried about the well-being of her granddaughters.
We don't ask if we're going to get any type of cancer or radiation exposure disease. We wonder when.
Gutierrez said that her hope is to be recognized by the federal government under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, so that the affected downwinders can get the help they need before it's too late.
All I can ask is that our government acknowledge the harm they've done to us, compensate the people so that they can get possibly health clinics built in these rural communities so that they can have early detection and stop the death. We're exposed to death all the time because of cancer. My family alone, my great-grandfather died of stomach cancer. We're 5 generations down, and that's a worry. And all we can ask is that our government do something about it to compensate those of us that were the first people ever exposed.
United States Senator Ben Ray Lujan is a representative for the state of New Mexico and has been an advocate to expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to cover those who are affected by the Trinity bomb.
Where the original RECA fell short is not including New Mexico or any counties in New Mexico as downwind counties that would provide support to the families that were exposed.
Lujan said that with the expiration date of RECA looming and the lack of support from federal officials, he's worried about the fate of the Tularosa Down Winders.
These families are right to be angry, right to be upset, right to be losing faith in the process that's supposed to be protecting them when they sacrifice and their family sacrificed for the national security efforts of America. That's where they should be.
The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is set to expire in the summer of 2024. After that, the United States Department of Justice will cease accepting claims from individuals affected by radiation, and as of now, there has been no federal legislation introduced that would cover New Mexico as a downwind state. Moving on, we're talking to the founder of the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium, Tina Cordova. Tina, thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Johnny, for inviting me to participate. It's always a great opportunity to be able to present our information to new audiences, and so this is a great opportunity for us, and we're glad for it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So can you just give a brief overview of who the Downwinders are for the people who might not know out there, and what the goal of the organization is?
Absolutely. So the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, or TBDC for short, was organized 18 years ago to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of their overexposure to radiation. So we've been doing this advocacy work for 18 years, and our primary goal is to pass amendments to what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA. That fund has been set up since 1990, so for 33 years. And the people of New Mexico were the first people exposed to radiation any place in the world as a result of a nuclear bomb. And we have been conspicuously missing from the fund. And so for 13 years now, there have been bills entered in Congress to add New Mexico to the list of downwinders, and bills have never been passed.
Absolutely. So do you want to just go into more about those bills? I know the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was set to expire, but can you tell us a little bit more about that and possible bills in the future that you'd like to be introduced into legislation?
You bet. So in 1990, Congress admitted that they had harmed people in the American West as a result of the testing that took place at the Nevada test site. The states that are designated downwind states, and it's just certain counties in these states, are Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. And we, like I said before, have been fighting to be added to that. And as we fight to add New Mexico to the fund, we also fight to add all of Idaho, all of Montana, all of Arizona, all of Nevada, all of Utah, all of Colorado, and all of New Mexico, as well as Guam. These are all places that were affected by nuclear testing. Many people don't know the history of this, but there were over 100 above ground tests conducted at the Nevada test site. New Mexico was regularly downwind of those tests as well, and that's very well documented. We had monitoring stations in New Mexico, and those monitoring stations picked up radiation that came to New Mexico as a result of the wind currents after the tests that they did in Nevada. But the compensation literally ends right at the New Mexico-Arizona border, and I always say as if there were a lead curtain there that protected us somehow. And so we were not only overexposed as a result of Trinity, but we were also overexposed as a result of the Nevada test site. And so we work with a national coalition to bring attention to all of this and to appeal to Congress to do the right thing and pass amendments to the RECA fund so that the people of New Mexico will be added. And not just the people of New Mexico, but what are called post-71 uranium workers. So many people don't understand the complete history of this, but New Mexico was long ago what we say declared a sacrifice zone. We have the cradle to grave process taking place here. The cradle is the opening up of the earth and the extraction of uranium. And as a matter of fact, we have over 1,000 abandoned mining and mill sites, uranium mining and mill sites across the Navajo Nation, Laguna, and Acoma Pueblo. Those sites are Superfund sites, and they've never been addressed or abated, and people continue to live adjacent to them and raise their children. If you mined uranium or worked in that field before 1971, RECA will offer you compensation and healthcare coverage, but it doesn't take care of the people that worked in that industry after 1971, and that's a complete oversight. Our government said basically that uranium became commercially available after 1971, and so they weren't going to take care of people any longer. So we're fighting on behalf of those people as well, and as you can imagine, in New Mexico, we have a great number of uranium workers. We were the largest producer of uranium at one time in the whole world, and one of the largest open pit mines any place in the world is at Powati, 45 miles from Albuquerque in Laguna Pueblo. So that's what we're fighting for, and that's what the RECA fund is all about. RECA has paid out $2.5 billion over 33 years to downwinders and uranium workers, and that's a lot of money. that money, we want to bring some of that restitution back to the people in New Mexico who have suffered and have died. And we want to make sure that they have adequate health care when they're diagnosed with cancer. So that's the work that we're doing.
So Tina, the detonation of the Trinity bomb is a well-known historical event, but not many people know about claims that the Downwinders make that humans were, affected by the fallout from the bomb. What do you attribute that lack of recognition to?
Well, the history has been very well suppressed, actually. The government said then, continues to say today, that no one lived here and no one was harmed, that the area was remote and uninhabited. But the reality is, and we've done the research on this. We have a map that was produced by a student from the University of New Mexico as part of a class project. And what he did was he took a map of New Mexico, he put all of the census tracts in from 1940, and then he established what the population was in New Mexico in 1940, drew radiuses around Trinity at 10-mile increments all the way to 150 miles. And what we know as a matter of fact is that there were about 15 children, women and men living in a 50-mile radius to the test site. And if you expand that radius to 150 miles, it encompasses Albuquerque to the north, Santa Fe to the north, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south, all the way to the Arizona border to the west and almost to the Texas border to the east. So it's essentially our entire state. And there were 500,000 people living within 150 miles. That's not remote and uninhabited. We lived far too close to a test site, and we've identified ranching families that lived as close as 12 miles. What we know, because we've been collecting health surveys for the better part of the last 16 years, is that many, many, many families were affected. And as a good example, in my own family, I'm the fourth generation to have cancer since 1945. When I was 39 years old, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And the first question they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? And they asked questions like, did you ever work in a lab? Did you ever have a lot of x-rays? Have you ever handled radioactive isotopes? And I said, no, no, and no. But I grew up in a community 45 miles away from the Trinity test site. And I feel like that's my absolute exposure. I had two great-grandfathers alive at the time of the bomb. They both died in 1955. They were told they had stomach cancer. There was no way to know because cancer was very rare in the population back then. And it was the first time people had heard the word cancer in our community. And they were told they had stomach cancer. They were given morphine. They were sent home to die. Both my grandmothers had cancer. My dad died from cancer after having 3 different cancers that he didn't have risk factors for. My sister has skin cancer. My mother's being followed for a tumor. And I've lost count of the number of cousins, uncles, and aunts that have had cancer. And now we know that there's a 5th generation in my family. I have a 23-year-old niece that lives in San Jose, California. She's going to college there. She was born and raised in New Mexico, and she has thyroid cancer too. And my family's not unique. We've documented hundreds of families just like mine where we have 5 generations of cancers. And while that is all awful, very awful history, the very most egregious part of the history is that we also know now, because there was a paper published in 2018 about the spike in infant mortality in New Mexico in the months directly after Trinity. We went from losing something like 30 babies per 1,000 to losing well over 100 babies per 1,000. It was the highest, our state had the highest infant mortality in 1945, and it extended into parts of 1946. And this is just not acceptable. Our government has never come back to account for this or atone for this, and families lost babies. As a matter of fact, the casualties from the first atomic bomb were American children. They were the babies in New Mexico.
You're fighting for New Mexicans to be covered by the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. In a perfect world, what will that do for the Downwinders in terms of access to resources as well as, monetary compensation?
So I always tell people we'll never fully know or understand the negative impact this has had on the people in New Mexico, and not just an emotional and a physical horrible toll it has taken, but it's also taken a horrible negative economic toll on the people of New Mexico. And let me explain. As I've traveled all over our state, talking to groups of people, participating in town hall meetings, collecting health surveys door to door in some communities, what I've heard is a story that goes something like this. I had a really good job. I had health insurance. I had retirement. My wife and I were looking forward to the day that I would retire. We were planning to travel. We were hoping to help our kids go to college, but I always had this ache in my belly and I sort of ignored it. And then my wife made me an appointment to see a gastroenterologist in Las Cruces because there's no doctor where I live. And I went and they did some tests and they told me that I have stage 3 colon cancer. They sent me to El Paso to an oncologist, and I was having to go, 4 times a week for chemotherapy. And in the beginning, I was able to hold my job and my health insurance, but it just got to be too much. And I lost my job. I lost my health insurance. I'm on Medicaid now. I've taken out all the equity in my house. I've maxed out 3 credit cards. There'll be no traveling for my wife and I. Will never help a child go to college. And most days, my kids are now sending me Visa gift cards so I can buy gas to go to El Paso. And most days, I wish I would die so that I wouldn't be a burden to my family anymore. And so what happens is people spend everything they have at the end to try to salvage their health, and they end up dying anyway, and their families are left with an negative economic burden. And we hear this all the time. I hear this, in towns all across New Mexico and in the Pueblos and on the Navajo Nation. And so we don't have an opportunity to generate any kind of generational wealth, and we don't have an opportunity to put our kids through college. And just as a matter of fact, I know because of our health surveying that a great number of downwinders and uranium workers rely on Medicaid to access health care at the end of their life. And 47% of all the people in New Mexico rely on Medicaid. It is impacted by the history that I'm sharing with you today. Those people would be then shifted off of Medicaid and put on to the very best health care coverage available any place in the United States. If you need a lung transplant, and the only place they do it is Kentucky, they take you there and they take care of everything. They take your family there. If you need round-the-clock nursing afterwards, they provide that. They'll pay your spouse to be your caregiver, and I think they pay them $75,000 a year. That's what I heard recently. So not only are you given a one-time payment of restitution of $150,000, but you get the very best health care available if you're sick. Now, aside from that, families would be able to apply on behalf of their deceased loved ones. And when we've lost so many people, I always say in a town like Carrizozo or Tularosa or Socorro, if just 100 people apply for the restitution, the one-time payment of restitution of $150,000, and they're approved, that's $15 million. And I always tell people, when's the last time $15 million was put into the hands of people in those small towns that have suffered greatly? And the answer is never. And then aside from that, the government will establish what are called radiation exposure screening and education program clinics across our state where people can go free of charge annually to be screened for cancer. Screening annually means that they catch things earlier and your prognosis is better and the cost of treatment is greatly reduced. So this would all have a very positive economic impact versus the very negative economic impact that we have experienced so far with the history of Trinity and our overexposure to radiation.
Tina, we only have about 1 minute left. So if you could just give me, what do policymakers need to do and what do you want our audience to know about the Downwinders? What needs to happen in order for these things that you're saying to happen? Just very briefly.
Well, first of all, everybody needs to join with us. I always say, now that you know this history, if you don't join with us and fight with us to get RECA amended and you remain complacent, then you're complicit in the entire environmental injustice that we've suffered. So everybody should contact our members of Congress and make sure that our members of Congress from New Mexico realize that this is important to all the people in New Mexico, not just those of us who identify as Downwinders or those of us who are fighting every day for this. So contact your members of Congress. And then aside from that, if you have family members someplace else, ask them to do the same thing. And for more information, people can always go to our website, which is www.trinitydownwinders.com. So trinitydownwinders.com. And I'll just mention that we're coming to Las Cruces in July for an art exhibit at the Brannigan Cultural Center, and the opening is July 15th, about noontime at Brannigan, and everybody can join with us there and learn a lot more about what we're doing.
Tina Cordova is the founder of the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium. Tina, thanks so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Johnny. Take care.
Of course. We now move on to the topic of nuclear storage. Holtec International is looking to build a nuclear storage facility in the southeastern part of New Mexico. Those efforts have been complicated with Michelle Lujan Grisham signing Senate Bill 53 into law. I took a look at both sides of the argument in this report. During the New Mexico legislative session, Senate Bill 53 was passed and signed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. The bill is aimed at prohibiting the storage and disposal of radioactive material in New Mexico until the state has consented to a facility. The bill will complicate Holtec International's efforts to build a nuclear storage facility in the southeastern part of the state. The company plans to build a facility that can store over 8,000 metric tons of uranium in commercially used nuclear fuel. For the surrounding communities, Holtec's proposed facility could lead to significant economic growth. Jason Shirley is the president of the Carlsbad Department of Development. He said Holtec's project will provide 500 jobs and $3 billion in capital investment to communities in the area.
This project brings hundreds of jobs to New Mexico. These are the kind of things that generally states would look for as far as economic development goes. These are well-paying, stable jobs that are going to come into our area, as well as billions of dollars in capital investment. And so it's not only an influx of jobs into our economy, but it's also an influx of dollars into our economy as well.
Shirley said that the threat of catastrophe with the transporting of fuel cells is minimal.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission says about a 1 in 10 trillion chance of a catastrophic event happening. And if that event happened, the cask still does not breach. There are other materials that are being transported every single day that have a far greater risk, to be honest. And not only that, these materials and similar materials are being transported in the United States as we speak, and so without incident. So while they're very valid questions and very valid concerns, it's important to look at what's actual fact and not some of the rhetoric that's being thrown around by people that honestly just want to stop the project for whatever their agenda is.
Much of southern New Mexico uses El Paso Electric Company for power. The total amount of electricity the company generated in 2021 via nuclear power was nearly 5,000 gigawatt hours, more than any other form of fuel. Despite the potential economic upsides of having a nuclear storage facility in New Mexico, there are many who oppose the idea of storing radioactive material in the state. Mary White is a member of the Tularosa Down Winders Consortium. She said that her family was in Carrizozo during the Trinity Site nuclear blast, and generations later, families are still affected by radioactive contamination and are still fighting for compensation from the federal government.
I'm the youngest of 10, and so these large families, we had many large families back then, and they're telling because the story repeats itself again and again and again, where the entire family, if not one living person, then they're all gone of cancer.
When it comes to the proposed nuclear storage site in southeastern New Mexico, White said that she doesn't have faith in the federal government to do the right thing, based on what's happened in the past.
It was Native Americans who primarily were used to extract uranium, and there were no precautions used. It's unnerving, right? It's very unnerving to think that our federal government knew, and they knew because they had Geiger counters. People in the know would wear covered suits, they would wear dosimeters to measure radiation, but the workers had none of that protection.
White said that the economic gain is simply not worth it in building a nuclear storage facility.
In essence, it would really be selling New Mexico out. It would be very bad, not just for us, but for many, many future generations. New Mexico's not a dumping ground for garbage or human excrement, much less something as dangerous as nuclear waste. We have been used in the past for the national stockpile of nuclear weapons. Our uranium was mined here. Trinity was the first bomb, and that's a track record. The federal government has never come back to take care of us. And so based on that track record, if the past is any indication of what the future might look like, we're not in for any help from the federal government should anything go wrong.
While a nuclear storage facility may bring money into the state, the risk of catastrophe, no matter how minimal, is too much for some New Mexicans. Nuclear storage is certainly an important topic that we here at KRWG will continue to cover. That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now at noon to 2, and All Things Considered from 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Johnny Coker. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.